A 43-inch iron rod went through this man's skull. He sat up, and he spoke. It happened in a single second, on a railway cutting in Vermont, in under his left cheek, behind his eye, and clean out through the top of his head. By every rule of medicine alive in 1848, Phineas Gage was already dead. But the rod had done something stranger than kill him. What it did to him, over the next 12 years, would quietly invent the science of the human brain. Then the story got told so badly, for so long, that almost everything you have heard about this man is false. The truth is stranger than the legend, and the proof is stamped into the iron itself. That summer, Gage was 25, and he was the best man on the crew. His employers called him the most efficient and capable foreman they had. Hard-working, level-headed, a great favourite with his men. His work was to blast a path through solid rock for a new railroad. Therefore, his life depended every single day on one simple iron tool. It was called a tamping iron. You poured blasting powder into a hole drilled in the rock, covered it with sand, then packed it down gently with a long rod before lighting the fuse. Gage's iron was made for him. 43 inches of solid pointed metal, 1.25 inches thick, 13¼ pounds. He had done it 1,000 times, but this time someone forgot the sand. The iron struck bare rock. It threw a spark straight into the powder, and the explosion turned 13 pounds of metal into a javelin. It entered under his left cheekbone, shattered a tooth, passed behind his left eye, tore through the front of his brain, and burst out through the top of his skull. The rod landed on the ground some distance away, streaked with blood. In 1 second, Phineas Gage had lost a large part of his left frontal lobe. His limbs convulsed. Then he steadied. Within a few minutes, he was talking. His men helped him into an ox cart, and he rode sitting upright for the 3/4-mile trip back to town. He climbed a flight of stairs to his own bed. And when Dr. John Harlow finally reached him, blood still running down his face, Gage looked up at him and said, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." Understand what that sentence means. A man with a hole through his brain had just made a joke about the size of the doctor's workload. He was not confused. He was not raving. Harlow wrote that he was perfectly rational and that he recognized everyone around him. The rod had taken a piece of his mind and left the rest of him standing there, making conversation. The next weeks nearly finished what the iron had started. The wound filled with infection. A swelling of fungus rose out of the hole in his skull, and Harlow, working before antibiotics existed, drained 8 ounces of pus from inside his head and burned the tissue back with silver nitrate. He simply refused to let his patient die. Therefore, astonishingly, it worked. By day 24, Gage sat up and took a step. Within a month, he was walking the stairs. But the men who had known him noticed something was wrong. The reliable, easygoing foreman was gone. In his place stood a man who was profane where he had never sworn, restless, impulsive, full of grand plans that he abandoned an hour later. His employers refused to give him his old job back. And his friends said the most haunting thing you can say about a person, that he was no longer Gage. Here is where a foreman's accident becomes one of the biggest ideas in science. In 1848, the brain was a black box. Nobody could prove that any particular part of it did any particular thing. Then came Gage, the same man in body, a different man in mind, and the only thing that had changed was that a specific piece of his brain was gone. His case became the first hard evidence that who you are, your temper, your judgment, your very self, lives in the physical tissue of the brain. And the wrong answers came first. The phrenologists, who believed the bumps of the skull mapped the soul, looked at where the rod came out and announced that it had destroyed his organ of benevolence and his organ of veneration. That, they said, was why he swore. It sounds absurd now, but it was the first time in history that anyone had pointed at a specific piece of a specific head and said, "That is where the man went." Serious doctors seized him too, from both sides. Some argued he proved the brain was one indivisible organ because he had lost a piece of it and could still speak. Others argued the opposite, that different regions do different jobs. That second camp turned out to be right, and it grew into modern neuroscience. Modern scans of his skull eventually settled the anatomy. The rod destroyed the left frontal lobe and left the right side of his brain intact. Even now, 2 out of every 3 introductory psychology textbooks still tell his story. Except most of them tell it wrong, not slightly wrong. The Gage in those textbooks is a man who never existed. Over the years, the story grew monstrous. Textbooks turned Gage into a drunk, a liar, a brawler, a psychopath, a man who beat his family and died penniless in the gutter. Every one of those claims is an invention. He had no wife and no children to mistreat. There is zero historical evidence of crime or drinking or ruin. The historian Malcolm Macmillan went back to the actual records and found that a tiny handful of real facts had been slowly inflated by scientists and storytellers alike into a legend that never happened. There is a reason the record is so thin. Harlow watched all of it, but he did not publish his full account until 1868, 20 years after the accident, and 8 years after Gage was already dead. By then, Gage could not correct anyone. Almost everything the world knows about the most famous patient in the history of neuroscience comes from a handful of pages, written largely from memory, about a man who was no longer alive to be asked. The real ending is quieter and far more human. After the worst of it, Gage put his life back together. He sailed to Chile, and for 7 years he drove a long-distance stagecoach on the mountain road between Valparaiso and Santiago. Think about what that job actually demands. He rose before dawn. He groomed and harnessed 6 horses. He held 6 sets of reins over 100 miles of brutal road, on schedule, with passengers behind him, through a country in political turmoil. That is not the work of a ruined man. That is planning, memory, patience and nerve every single day for 7 years. A physician who knew him in those years wrote that Gage was in good health, with no impairment whatever of his mental faculties. Macmillan's conclusion is that the worst of the change was temporary, and that the structure of the work itself had rebuilt him. The man the textbooks call a ruined monster had, in truth, made a remarkable recovery. It did not last forever. In February 1860, 12 years after the accident, the seizures began. On the 18th of May, he left his work in Santa Clara and went home to his mother. 2 days later, at 5 in the morning, he had a severe convulsion. They kept coming, again and again, for about 36 hours. Phineas Gage died on the 21st of May, 36 years old. His skull, and the very iron that passed through it, sit to this day in a museum at Harvard, among the most requested objects in the collection. For 150 years, nobody even knew what he looked like. Then, in 2007, a collector in Baltimore posted an old photograph online. She and her husband had owned it for 30 years, and they had always called it the Whaler, a battered, one-eyed man posing with his harpoon. The internet looked closer. That is not a harpoon, someone wrote. That is a tamping iron. Detail by detail, the picture was identified as the first known photograph of Phineas Gage, and it shows everything the legend says should not exist. A well-dressed, handsome man, groomed and upright, confident, almost proud. His left eye is closed, his forehead carries the scar, and in his hands, gripped like a trophy and not a curse, he holds the iron itself. Even his photograph spent 30 years being misread. People saw a battered whaler because that was the story they expected to see. When the truth finally surfaced, it looked like a man who had won. And there is one detail on that iron that almost nobody mentions. Someone had it engraved in 1850, while Gage was still alive and still working. It reads, "This is the bar that was shot through the head of Mr. Phineas P. Gage. He fully recovered from the injury. The object itself has been telling the truth for 170 years. We simply stopped reading it." So one iron rod taught the world 2 things. The first, that the brain is not some mysterious vapor, but the physical seat of who we are. The second is harder. A handful of real facts, retold by people who each wanted a slightly better story, hardened into a lie that outlived every man who knew him. Phineas Gage survived a rod through the brain. His reputation did not survive the retelling. He walked out of that rock cut, he spoke to his doctor, and he spent 7 more years steering 6 horses over a mountain. The monster was never there, because sometimes the biggest picture in history hides inside the smallest detail.